Live streaming is on.
Hello, Global Theater. My name is Gerry Fialka. Today is April 15, 2022. Welcome to McLuhanMashups number 21, where we probe Marshall McLuhan in layperson's terms. I'm going to start with recalling what happened when W.C. Fields was caught looking at the Bible. They said, "What are you looking at the Bible for?" He said, "I'm looking for loopholes." So that's what that's what I'm doing with Marshall McLuhan's books every day of my life, looking for loopholes. But again, I have another uh, great epiphany. Banned books are the hot topic these days, and I think we should ban all of McLuhan's books so that we could keep future Henry Kissingers, or Kiss of Death, as Marshall called them, and Steve Bannon's from ruining the world because they studied McLuhan and just keep it an elitist thing. It's like when Eric McLuhan showed up for a lecture at Google a couple years ago. He purposely didn't teach them well because he didn't want them to know how to run the world good with McLuhan insights. But it's an honor and a pleasure for us to be here with Rob Dew, Duncan Echelson, and Clinton Ignatov on his amazing station called Concern Medicine, because Clinton has just authored an incredible two-part article on the classical trivium, which is a McLuhan book that was written in 43 but didn't come out till 2006. So how's that for keeping McLuhan away from people? And it only costs about $25 used online, so don't be scared of getting it and trying to read it. You'll never understand it. Don't worry about that. But that's 79 years ago. This book came out. So Clinton, let's just start off. Why in the heck did you write your article, McLuhan Synthesis? That word means putting together. Or deductive reasoning, but what does synthesis mean in regards to the title of your article?
So the articles are still a work in progress. I've got 2 out so far. Synthesis means putting together. McLuhan's called a synthesizer because he didn't have a lot of new ideas, but he took a whole bunch of ideas that were floating around and he packaged them together and delivered them in a coherent whole. This is basically what was credited. The same process was credited to Thomas Aquinas in the 12th century, who the works of Aristotle and Socrates were newly being translated and into Latin in Europe, and were so all this pagan stuff was flooding the Catholic culture, and there was a potential for harm or fighting, or conviction of heretics. Oh my God, these people are studying these pagan heretics from before Jesus was born, right? This is a flooding into our Christian world. And so what Thomas Aquinas is credited with doing is integrating lots of what Aristotle was saying into Catholic tradition so as to try and get them to work together in discourse, to synthesize something like a new Western philosophy that sort of put the opposing parts at peace. The word synthesis is probably most known because of the Hegelian dialectic. A philosopher named Hegel a couple hundred years ago became famous talking about a thesis versus a antithesis combining to become a synthesis. And so I'm trying to figure out and tussle out what McLuhan's synthesis was, and the parts he was synthesizing together into what became his synthesis.
What a summary, man. You kept it in layman's terms. So we're going to turn to Rob Dew and then Duncan. Now, Rob, you've studied McLuhan with us and offered major insights over the years, and especially important because you're teaching kids or let's say you're teaching students McLuhan subversively. They don't even want McLuhan to be taught in college. And you do it, thank God. But let's just say, you know, McLuhan's that was really good intro there, Clinton, because just before I go to Rob, it's like Joyce called himself Applied Aquinas. Marshall called himself Applied Joyce.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea of two things, I'm going to take myself and this other guy, and I'm going to, you use the word integrate, reintegrate. But I'm going to claim we're alchemists, that McLuhan was an alchemist, and he takes two known things, puts them together, and comes up with a third new unknown thing. That's sort of synthesis, right? That's
precisely.
Hegelian. Yeah, that's Hegelian and all that Hegelian stuff. So, Rob, what are the two things in your studies of McLuhan that he put together, and what did he come up with a third new thing? Just off the top of your head.
Wow, I feel like I didn't study for the quiz enough.
But I mean, what's the two main things you teach of Marshall? You know, and then
I teach the tetrads.
Yeah.
And then I get into sense ratio. I get into, you know, quite a lot of his basic and the sort of more memeable ideas because they're digestible by the group.
Mm-hmm.
What I took away from Clinton's articles was quite interesting. It's really a rallying cry for McLuhan as a way of understanding the world. And as I understood what he was saying, which is by no means expert, I feel like I'm bringing the layman to layman's terms here.
We're getting laid, Rob. We're getting laid. Yeah.
No, not so lucky. But McLuhan's willingness is to observe things in a non-time-based way, and to use terminologies and understandings that are not filtered through the current rudimentary human measurements of the day, which were scaled to the proportionality of the reality of the day.
Mm-hmm.
He's willing, going back to your first question, his notions about the past, the present, and the future, and how much they affect each other and how much they affect our understanding. So he tries to look at things on a larger scale and strip it from its cultural overlay, its sort of habitual, cliched human touch, if you will. And I thought that was very interesting. And I think that is an important skill for getting us to objectify our own reality, for getting the fish to recognize the water.
Dude, that was brilliant, because I would say he took time-based, this non-time-based way, this tactility, human touch, and came up with a willingness to observe. That was really good, Rob. Okay, Duncan, you're up.
Yeah, yes, I am. Synthesis. First of all, I should say I'm here as I did buy a copy of the classical, and I did read both of Clinton's articles. And the first article was very about how technology seemed to be pushing beyond itself. In other words, instead of proceeding in order, it was just like, well, let's resources and all these ideas and make them as fast and as wide, and let's make a shitload of money with this.
Mm-hmm.
The ultimate synthesis, which I think human beings after, is how do we make our clever, sometimes intelligent monkey harmonize with the world.
Mm-hmm.
And Clinton, in his second article, which I read and have not digested totally, but seems that part of the promise an end from Clinton is that by going back into the human prime technology, which is language, and understanding how it's and taking clues from the classics, we might get a balance between ourselves, natural world, and the technological world.
Yeah.
But we're aiming for.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned getting our monkey brains to adapt to to our environments, because right, that's a recurring point. Lots of people talk about how we evolved to live in nature, but McLuhan's point is that since we became human in the sense of inventing things and creating environments that pull us out of nature, our bodies are mismatched to the new second nature environments and extensions of ourselves that we make, right? And so the proportions of our world get distorted from what they were when we were no better than surviving moment by moment, governed by Darwinian processes or what have you. Absolutely.
Clinton, let me interrupt. That was really good, Rob and Duncan. Oh, go ahead, Duncan. You wanted to add something?
No, I don't think about anything at this particular time. I'm really here more as a student than anything else. I mean, I think I really enjoyed the first article, and then the second article, which was focused on McLuhan's writings of 70 some odd years ago on the trivium. When I first heard of the classical trivium book, which was via Clinton, as is my nature, I bought it. But in all truth, after looking at a couple pages when it arrived, it's been sitting on my bookshelf. So I'm pretty excited about the idea of actually getting into it more. And I'm always excited about finding a new compass in this complex, mystifying world that I live in.
We all do.
That was good, Duncan. Then if you hold on, Clint, if you mute, then I know when to call on you when you unmute. Good, that was perfect. So perfect follow up, and this is a good lead in to the next step is, the things you guys brought up. Robbie bringing up non-time based way, tactility. Duncan bringing up technology and language, and then you followed with monkey brain. And I was amazed about somewhere you said electronic brain, because I learned from McLuhan there's 3 ways of communication: spoken word, printed word, and electronic word. In general, gestures in there somewhere, and there's ESP or whatever. But this 3 thing is reflected in reintegrating the classical trivium: grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. So, just to keep it basic, Clinton, what the heck is difference between grammar, dialect, and rhetoric in real simple terms? Because I have etymologically in dictionary a few words I could spew out. Should I do that now or let you go first?
No, I'll jump in there, and then you can see where they fit, I suppose.
Yeah.
Well, if you take McLuhan's word for it, and I mean, that's sort of my job, is to believe everything he says, and then I'm a very uncritical reader of McLuhan. I've just decided to make that, and if he's wrong, I don't mind. I don't mind being saddled with that.
You mean his whole fallacy's wrong?
His whole fallacy's wrong. So if you take his word for it,
is that a question or a statement, Clinton?
I'd have to go watch Annie Hall again to confirm. The ancient Greeks, before writing, used Homer's poetry, Homer's Odyssey, and all that as like a storehouse of their historical culture, and as a story that enraptured people and made boys into men. And after later on, the interpretation of these stories became important for philosophy, specifically the sort of spiritual or religious philosophy. There's a way of interpreting stories where it's like, where these stories that you were told were then interpreted like, oh, do you know what this means? Do you know what that means? If you read Homer's Odyssey, it'll have stuff like, oh, there's a cave with olives above it, and there's 2 entrances, one for men and one for gods, and inside there are jars filled with honey and bees, you're not right. And it sounds like nice poetic language, but the substance of an education for centuries was teaching, all right, what does that story mean? You see, the olives represent this, and the bees represent that, and here's what the Cyclops represented when Odysseus, was trapped in the Cyclops cave, and here's why, right? So we were always interpreting stories, and the job of interpreting a story or a text to find the symbolic meaning or to make them a symbolic meaning is grammar. So in the classical Western education for over 1,000 years, you were taught grammar as a means of interpreting, first and foremost, the Bible, but then also these other stories, right? Cultural stories, like learning to interpret a text and decode the symbolism, if you like. Was one arm of your of the classical trivium, and then the second branch was rhetoric, which was how to speak and write, right? So it's like, if grammar is taking in, then rhetoric is putting out into the minds of others so as to persuade them, right? So as to be a good lawyer, or to be a good statesman, or to be this person on hand who delivers the eulogy at a funeral, or who cheers the host, right? To be a good rhetor is to know how to stand and speak and be eloquent and steer the crowd and persuade the minds, right? So you got grammar and rhetoric, and dialectic is to be logical in figuring stuff out. So here's what if you got 2 rhetoricians fighting, like lawyers in a courtroom, each trying to use logic to pin the other one down. Oh, you said this, but what about that, right? And so to be a well-rounded person was to have the interpretive power of grammar, and to have the persuasive ability of rhetoric, and to have the logical capacity of dialectic, which is right, to make sense, to be logical, and to play ideas against each other to get to the bottom of them. So this was the trivium. So you would learn that, and then later you would learn the quadrivium, which is like the sciences, like what things are, right? Here's how nature works. Here's astronomy, all this stuff. So McLuhan spent as I say in the second article here, he was trying to figure out the text of this guy named Harvey, or of Nash, in the 16th century, and everything he had read about it was wrong after 2 years of studying it. So then he figured out that Nash was using grammar, so he studied more about grammar, and he studied more about rhetoric, and he read a whole bunch of books, like old books, going back, to Cicero. Right? He uncovered for himself in his own reading the roots of the history of education using the trivium, and he saw how different parts in the education system were stressed over others throughout the centuries, and he developed his own intuitive understanding of the trivium of rhetoric, grammar, and dialectic, and then he used that as a interpretive tool. And just for one final point, I'm glad you brought up, you called him an alchemist, Jerry. You called McLuhan an alchemist. Very explicitly in this book that I'm saying everyone should read, the Classical Trivium, McLuhan delves deep into alchemy and shows how alchemists were just people who were using grammar to try and decode the actual natural world. of, you know, gold and lead and trees and fire and right the elements, right? They were taking the grammatical method of that was being applied to texts and being applied to Homer's Odyssey, and they were putting it on to analyze the book of the world as well, right? So yeah,
Super, Clinton, that was really good, because now we can go to Rob. Rob, you teach kids. Yeah, I mean, you're a teacher, and you're using these three classical, the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic. And Marshall studied this through, you know, he actually, they say, reintegrated the three. That's what Gordon says in the intro to the classic trivium, the 2006 version. He reintegrated the three. And Nash, if you look him up in Wikipedia, he says he's a playwright, a poet, and a satirist. But if you listen to Marshall on Richard Altman's little clip on YouTube, like 1 minute, Marshall on Nash, it's really a good 1 minute clip. He says, Thomas Nash, a popular journalist. So Rob, you actually, you know, tell us the difference. You're taking, how do you use those three memes, grammar, dialectic, rhetoric, and teach kids journalism? Like, you use what journalism is as current events, but it's almost like in the realm of them being of the current events being poetic or playwright or satirist. You know, that's how you, yeah, I mean, how you swoop them into it or whatever, you know, jump off on that.
Well, you start with something like a pop culture event like the Oscar slap that has already captured their imagination, and then you take it into whatever, you know, what you want to talk about. And, you know, a technique I've learned from you is I try to let them give their answers and let them fumble about before I say what I think it is. Because once I do, then, and especially if I have a, you know, a long extended passage explaining and I'm getting into details, they're going to feel intimidated to come up with sort of a, you know, a smaller minded example. So that's one thing. Since we're on the topic of education, I wanted to mention the trivium and the quadrivium was considered the classical education, and it was taught to European men all throughout 16, 17, 1800s. After the loss in the Franco-Prussian War, the Prussians abandoned that system because it was teaching their soldiers, and particularly their officers, to think for themselves.
Whoa!
And they instituted what was known as the Prussian education system, which became the basis for the American education system. It eliminated the trivium and the quadrivium, which you did the trivium first, but you learned how to think, how to use language, and how to express yourself. And then you went out and learned astronomy, music, geometry. I can't remember the fourth one, and mathematics maybe. And rather than what we do is the opposite, is we cram their heads with information. You know, World War II started in 19 and so forth. And we separate the topic so that there's no unity of thought. Things are bifurcated. You know, biology, you're studying biology. That's different than chemistry. That's different than English. And many other things that they did in the Prussian education system designed to essentially produce a compliant soldier, and then later in America, a compliant factory worker. So I just wanted to bring that up as a, you know, as a just a reference point. The other thing I wanted to say on Clinton's larger ideas was, you know, we're stuck with all of this monkey brain measurement. Inches, I think an inch is approximately isn't it have something to do with your thumb or the digits? Yeah, it's,
like
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The foot, obviously, and they make perfect sense in that world. Along comes the metric system, which is much more logical, much more dialectical. It's easy, it's dividable. You know, we don't need to be attached to these early things, and yet we still are. Particularly, I mean, here in America, here in the empire. But there's numerous examples. Gerry, you often bring up the horsepower as an evaluation for a car's speed and all this. we have all of these sort of things that we've inherited. The typewriter, the layout of the keys is an inherited false paradigm, or at least a more inefficient paradigm for doing things. We've inherited all this stuff, and while I think it's noble and great for Clinton to suggest we should use McLuhan to go back and re-examine, I think what we've seen is that humans are very, very attached to the way they grew up and what they remember and the good old days, and maybe even more so in the times that we live now, where society and technology move forward so fast. The desire to want to hold on to the past, I think you could argue, is increased as at this point. But by the time you hit 50, the world doesn't look like it did as you were a child. And that's unnerving to quite a lot of people. And increasingly that difference will be, maybe already it's 30 or 40. Are the millennials looking at the Gen Z and looking at society now and going, wow, that's weird? Well, if they aren't doing it now, they will in 20 years.
Oh, yeah.
And so
I used to be a Facebook person. They're going to do that. You brought up a lot of great things, Rob. That was brilliant. And I really appreciate that, because that is rear view mirrorism. That's what Martin said, rear view mirrorism. And we want security in our life, and we want, like, I've decided in my life right now, I will never drive a car again. I know how to drive. I've driven for 40, I'm almost 70. I've driven for 50 years. I have no use to ever want to waste any more brain cells driving a car. It's Repo Man. The line in the movie goes, the more you drive, the less intelligent you are. Now, that's stupid, but it's just like, why should I even put myself in that situation? I've just surrendered, which it's not really smart, because I'm still going to ride my bike, and I could get killed on a bike probably
much easier
in a car. But that was really good. You brought up a lot, but let's get Duncan in there, because I know, Duncan, that you actually bought the book like I did, and then realized like Clinton says, if you get through the trivium, if you get through classic trivium, you'll be able to just flow through Mr. McLuhan. Yeah, right. But Duncan, I know you studied dialectic and rhetoric. Go off wherever you want to start.
Well, it's obvious that Rob and I had an immense session, because actually I disagree with a number of Rob's points. Although I really liked the story of the Prussians, the trivium, after they lost the war, because they wanted their soldiers not to think. Please notice that's what machines are. That's where the idea of the cog in the machine comes. I put words in Clinton's mouth, but this I got from both of us was a need for intellectual, technological humility, and that the value of the trivium was to teach us proportionality and to keep us more focused on language than mathematics. And mathematics, which is very useful in developing technological things, has a flaw. It becomes our dominant way of thinking, which is it gives us the delusion that we're being more realistic and precise than we really are. And this is the value of studying language in depth and the way language is used, is that a deep study of language, as any student of Joyce knows, leads you to increasing levels of humility vis-a-vis the language itself and vis-a-vis the world. So actually, I would like to hear what Clinton's written is to what just said, because I may have been putting words in his mouth.
Well, I heard what you said, and it sounds like you mean my whole history is wrong.
No, I like the part of the history, but the idea of like I with when I studied acupuncture, and acupuncture still used those kind of bodily measurements when you're looking for acupressure points or acupuncture points. They use something to the inch, and there's all this thing where you actually, as a practitioner, when you're looking points on a patient's body, you get an idea of the patient's inch. In other words, I got my inch. Basically, if you curl your index finger, it's the distance between the top joint and the next and I'll call it the middle joint in the finger. It's called a sun. Okay, so I got mine, but every patient I have is going to have a little bit different. So if I'm going to do this system, I need to at least look at the patient's finger and get an idea of how that compares with my sun. So I kind of like these inch and foot things, as long as the person using them is fully aware of their origin and the fact that, of course, if you're going to use your forearm, which, the forearm, I think it was from the wrist to the elbow was how Noah built his ark. It was so many cubits. And a cubit was basically the distance between Noah and the ark's wrist and his elbow. So I think those are good. And I think and I have to say I like the metric system also. But as I will continue to come back point that metric system gives a false sense of precision. What do I mean by that? Well, of course, if they've got the centimeter in metal in some place in Europe, and that's the standard, yes, you can be very precise that way. But is the natural world precise in that manner? And I would tend to argue, no, the natural world is not precise at all. As a matter of fact, the way that the world rolls on, and I will be bold and say will roll on forever, because it has all this input and redundancy built in, and is goddamn proud of it. Gives it flexibility.
Yeah, I really love. There's so much more. I love the fact that Rob brought up human measurements in the most literal sense of inches and feet, and how we're contrasting it with the metric system. I work at the beer store, and I'm constantly dealing with 12 packs and 2 4s and 6 packs, and having to count, and double, 24s, 48s, 96, right? And like the fractionality of the metric, the fractionality of the imperial system is so much more useful because being with everything being divisible by 2 and 3, it allows you to geometrically put things in so many more patterns and count intuitively that I understand why, right, the metric system being only divisible by 2 and 5, being base 10 would never work in a million years for dealing with beer bottles or eggs in a carton or any other actual useful practical reasons for fairly breaking up a whole bunch of things into equally sized units of measure, right? Rob?
Well, this is really interesting, and we had a lengthy discussion. I don't think you were there for it, Clinton, about time and how the way that we divide up time, and we have 7 days, and the months are uneven, and it's a real distraction it's a real clouding of thought. And I could just imagine, I was imagining you in your store, someone says, hey, comes in and says, I need 8 liters of something, and you got to convert it, and so on and so forth. I mean, these sort of meaningless computations, which computers do, let's bring it back to the topic, that computers do effortlessly. They, unless you're very, very good at, perhaps you or one, they kind of cloud your mind. It's almost like you have all these different bases for measurement. And then, we can try to extrapolate that out to things other than just liquids. We have all these bases for measurement bouncing around in our head. I mean, what negative effect does that have on comprehension and perhaps the ability to do what I think you were suggesting in your piece, which was a more cohesive and dare I say godlike view of things, so sort of to step back and have the human see the human condition not as a human, but perhaps as an understander of the history and what has gone before. Is that correct?
Yeah, McLuhan notes how most of Wyndham Lewis's stories, like for instance, Wyndham Lewis has a novel called Apes of God. And so these artists with a cubist perspective at the beginning of the 20th century had because they had multiple different perspectives in the head at the same time. They sort of gave themselves this God's eye view, and they were too busy, huffing their own supply and feeling superior to just appreciate that what they're experiencing. McLuhan would say is just the electronic condition, the discarnate electronic condition of feeling like you're out of your body or out of the human experience when you try to see what's beneath so many different incommensurable perspectives. Yes, it's a bird's eye view of the human situation, but that's something that he tried to reconcile with embodiment, which is how we get up with these idea that our media are extensions of ourselves. You're still embodied when you extend yourself into the environment. Like a cane extends your hand, or like a bicycle extends your body, or a car extends your ability to travel. You as an embodied self are you and the technology that you're using. And yes, us here now being broadcast on YouTube are being extended across the planet in theory, right? So, and you are embodied. Your sense of embodiment is extended out that large, right? We are elephantine in proportion just by being here in front of camera, right?
We're all elephant men. We're the elephant man. No, we're the elephant person. But both Robbie and Duncan brought up that word proportion, which is an interesting word. I went to the etymology of it: size, comparative, relation, measure. And Roy couldn't attend today, but he had a good question for you, Duncan. Clinton, and Duncan and Rob can join in. Who are the artists who bootstrap in the ratios? This is your quote in your article.
Oh, yeah.
Ratios of proportion across the wild scales of modern existence. That's pretty colorful language there, Clint. But did you use the word bootstrap? Because he didn't put it in quotes.
Yeah, that was my word. And
right. So what is what is an artist? Just explain, put that in context. What is an artist bootstrapping the ratios across the wild scale of modern existence? What's that mean, and who are those artists?
Specifically in poetry, it's can you use language which gives an intuitive, visceral feel of, okay, so think about Carl Sagan talking about the billions of billions, the human compared to the cosmos, or just think of how people, the existentialists consider ourselves as insignificant specks against the scope of the universe, right? They're striving to come up with poetic language, a speck of dust, a mote in God's eye. They're trying to come up with language to proportion what it feels like to know that you exist against the size of, now they're just talking about physical, geometric, Newtonian space, the size of us, as a physical sense, right? And then think of Ozymandias by Percy Shelley, that poem about behold my works, ye mighty, and despair, right? And it's just a busted statue in the middle of nowhere surrounded by sand, right? And so compared to the lengths of time, this Ozymandias' empire was but a blip, right, in the historical radar, and crumbled to dust long ago, forgotten, right? So people are always trying to proportion the human scale versus
Right.
everything, whatever everything is.
The term light year is a good example.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost unfathomable, right? If you can imagine,
you can't imagine the distance, so you put it in terms of how long it would take you to travel there if you could travel at the speed of light, which you can't even get close to. So yeah, you're right. I mean, this is the McLuhan thing of looking in the mirror. We're always scaling in proportion. We often bring it back to human proportion, even as we discover new thought. Obviously, that we've gotten much better at the micro scale and the macro scale, and the new telescope will show us new things. And but we often bring it back to the human scale. And real quickly on the artists, I mean, I'd like to hear what your examples of artists are, but you brought up the Cubists, and the Cubists and the Dadaists, and even later the Surrealists, were doing some very interesting things, playing with reality. And this is all in the early 20th century, trying to really almost give a visual to some of Einstein's ideas of relativity. I mean, there is evidence of that connection with Picasso. And of course, also Picasso was stealing from everybody else, so he was very proportional. He was stealing from all the other artists in the time and just did it better or whatever. But it's interesting to me that we had those sort of movements in the earliest part of the 20th century. But then as we get to certainly the 60s and 70s, advertising. And then, of course, you see Warhol and Lichtenstein, and then even the minimalists. So you had, you've got a lot, the abstract expressionists, of course, too. It's interesting that it went in this direction, and that the art went from trying to explore the micro and the macrocosmos on the canvas, which is a challenge, to just reflecting what's in the world, which is advertising. Bringing it back to the human scale once again, almost, or bringing it back to the human discourse. Right. Yeah.
It's almost like things had to snap back to a new norm.
Or maybe they do, you could argue that, there was a real progression there. And even the abstract expressionists now go further with what they did in the 40s to sort of say, okay, we're not even going to have, it's not going to be a vase and a woman as Picasso would have painted. It's going to be whatever I feel. And it's now emotional and expressive. I mean, it's almost like a return to infancy. And that's what they tried to do. Automatic action, to paint without thought. And then, but then it returns to this sort of mimicry. I'm not downgrading Warhol at all. I think there was real brilliance there, but it is a sort of mimicry. As a codex, as a visual codex, it's mimicking actually machine art.
I like
it's mimicking machine art. It's the human becoming more like the machine. That's the way he painted. And Basquiat was a mix. He had the hand stuff, the fluid stuff. I see Duncan wants to jump in, so I'm going to wrap up. But then, both of them had a lot of printed and stencils and so forth, which is machine.
Yeah. Garbage in, garbage out.
Duncan, just before you jump in, because this is again okay, go ahead. Okay, yeah. This is scam on advertising, because I try to put so much weight on promoting advertising as something worthy. And I don't know, always Duncan's like, this is a scam to get you to buy shit you don't need. But it is interesting that McLuhan said that advertising is the cave art of the 20th or 21st or 22nd century. So that's returning to your childlike innocence. And then all the artists, the guy who invented Art Nouveau, the guy who wrote Wizard of Oz, Andy Warhol, Frank Zappa, watch all the new David Mamet fucking controversy out there on his thing about they all started in advertising, or they were advertisers. They were out to regurgitate what the symbolists taught them is I'm after the effect. The effect precedes the cause. But please, and one last quickie is there's a documentary on YouTube by Marty Scorsese, how Cubism affected cinema and how cinema affected Cubism. So it's that
Oh, I want to see that.
Yeah, it's just a Mobius strip. Okay, Duncan, I was really anxious to hear what all that was discussed.
Well, I actually turned on my microphone because I wanted to say I believe I heard Andy Warhol being asked about being a machine, and he said that he wished he was a machine.
Yep.
That he would like to be a machine.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that was okay. Now I'm going to go too far, I'm sure. Andy Warhol was an alienated weirdo who was trying to find his way in the world.
Fair.
And he discovered that if he did advertising like stuff and kept himself out of it as much as possible as an actual person, but presented himself actually as almost like a Campbell's soup king himself, he would do fine, because that's what the smart money wanted.
Interesting.
Yeah, you know, and Gerry and I are obviously going to have this discussion going for as long as us are on the planet. Yeah, of course, a lot of got involved with advertising. They need to earn a living. But it's always important to realize that ultimately the money boys who decided art would stay. And they were the actual arbiter. And I don't, you know, it's okay as purely images. There's nothing I love better than to be in a foreign country where I don't speak the language and look at the advertising than it is to be in my own country where I do speak the language and I hate the advertising. Because you know, they're just trying to sell me shit. They're using the talents of artists to do that because they know that people respond to clever images and clever scenarios. With that, I will be quiet. I think I had other things I wanted to say, but I can't remember what it was. So that's a sign I should be quiet.
Duncan, just unmute when you want to add. That was good. But one quickie thing, which you brought up both, Rob, this whole thing about, this is Bob Dobbs teaching me what the Android meme is, or what I understand it to be, is that we invent something, then that invention has hidden psychic effects. Then we start imitating the hidden psychic effects. Oh,
absolutely.
I had a dream last night. It was just like I was in Star Wars, and then all of a sudden someone switched the channel and I was in David Lynch's reality TV show. So it's all like, well, what are you doing? You're dreaming something that already exists, and that's the content of your dreams, or the form of your dreams is from other inventions. And so then the human disappears, and it's just the hidden psychic effects talking to each other. You know, it's one TikTok talking to another TikTok. So I thought it's a perfect lead in. Clinton, we'll start with you. Is Roy's question was, what does poetic proportions mean in the development of computers? Why not call it technological proportion? Why did you call it poetic proportions? And you're a specialist in the development of the computer. You're on mute, dude.
I use the word proportionality in this essay so much, and this whole essay I'm trying to stress and center the concept of proportionality because, okay, think about how often people use the word balance. I need balance in my life, right? Buddhism is about finding a balance, a middle path, right? And a balance, if you picture a balance, it's two. It's one thing against another. If every person who talked about finding a work home balance or an online offline balance or a diet balance instead thought in a multiple relational term of proportionality, if they replaced the word balance with the word proportionate, and they measured apples to oranges in relation to the size and scope of their ability and their reach and their body and their age and their place in the in the social structure, if they sought proportionality of all things against other things and stopped stressing this two-term word balance, we'd be a lot healthier in a spiritual sense, I think. That's one element that I want to stress heavily. So in relation to computers, the popular language is just to trust science fiction authors to tell us what our world is made of. And science fiction authors just like, well, maybe the machine's so complicated, maybe it's alive. Maybe we should give it human rights. Maybe your AI is more aware than you are. Maybe you're a robot, right? All these ideas which are... have got nothing to do with actually getting in touch with the substance of our world, but all to do with projecting these metaphysical and cosmological and spiritual dreams onto our material world, which have got nothing to do with getting to the substance and the history of them in any meaningful sense, right? We're projecting Pinocchio onto AI, like that Kubrick Spielberg film from the year 2000, right? It's just Pinocchio as a robot trying to become a real boy, right? And I mean, that myth has it's a interesting story, but that's we can't let our decisions in the real world be premised on these ancient mythological ideas. Peter Pan comes up in early McLuhan through Wyndham Lewis as an example of this reversion to childhood, and like we've been using stories and literature to approach our human condition and the status of our world, but we need stories which reflect the actual scope of our machines. Our machines, as I argue in the first article I wrote, are very, very, very fast, extremely fast. And as a cheat, we say, oh, this old computer I got from 1992 is ancient. It's so slow, but that thing does like 12 million calculations a second. You can't do that. It's actually exceedingly fast. And the fact that we're a million times faster than that now just means we're exceedingly stupendously fast, right? Like the scopes and scales in a mathematical sense break our brain in the same way that however many light years to Alpha Centauri is kind of understandable because I know how long a year is, and so but it boggles my mind, right? But then this size of the galaxy, and the size of the galaxy, like the Galaxy song from Monty Python is all about, right? Numbers fail us when it comes to proportions. They are not an embodied sense. Yeah,
Right.
Rob.
Well, Duncan, do you want to go?
Yeah, actually, I do want to go because there was also the word poetic in there. And I would say that one of the things that attracted Clinton's article was I view you, Clinton, as a pretty technologically savvy person, and it's refreshing to hear you talking about proportionality and that maybe things are moving along too fast and are getting out of human proportion. I believe that the term poetic, to call something having, referring to something have a poetic dimension, or it actually is referring to human scale. And we have this weird thing now where the average Joe on the street, when they hear about the new computer that's, unfathomable amount faster and has 4 terabytes of memory and all this stuff, and they run out and buy it, it's totally absurd. There's no need for it all. It's just a marketing thing, or a a thing developed by technological jack-off artist. Hardly anybody needs it. It's like here in Texas, we got all these fucking yahoos driving around in huge trucks. Okay? That's not proportional.
And they're not all in the construction business, I assume.
They're not, I would say, no more than half, if even half. They're drugstore cowboy types. The same thing happens with computers, et cetera, et cetera. Referring to the science fiction authors, I think you're right, that if there is not a focus on human scale, and I don't say it always has to be focused on human scale, but primarily our technological and artistic efforts should at least take the human being into consideration. If things are not to spin totally out of control. So let me give it. Hey, Rob.
Yeah. Couple thoughts. What struck me about you were talking about there, Clinton, was it's really about a consciousness and awareness on the part of the human being of the world outside them. And I would say that has improved in the 20th century. There are people, you could argue that people who are environmentalists have a global consciousness. They're aware it's not just, well, we can't pollute here in America. It's no, we shouldn't pollute anywhere because that's affecting our entire biosphere. That, and certainly multiculturalism, Americans and white males have become aware that there's an important history outside of the white male history that we mostly were taught in our own upbringing. That's changing. So, it's a progression towards consciousness. And there is that, I do think that there is a growth there. In our time, the men are starting to realize that the thoughts and ideas of women were perhaps suppressed through history, and that, even some of our heroes, we can look at their writing, Nietzsche and certain other people, that you can see the thread. I think we talked about this in the last Zoom. Does the sexism of the sort of inherent sexism of earlier giants, does that disqualify them, and so forth and so on? So the consciousness, it is progressing, and it is becoming more aware and less localized. That said, there's still people completely locked within a tribal consciousness. You don't look like me, you don't talk like me, who the hell are you? And then the other thing I wanted to say too about these sort of human proportionalities, I wanted to bring up the golden ratio in the hero's journey and just say that there is maybe, beyond the sort of human measurements, there is maybe a universal measurement. I mean, the golden ratio is the formula by which nature is chaotically created, and there is a order to that chaos. The pattern repeats. You'll see the same sort of deteriorating cliff structures in the Grand Canyon, but you could also see that in a small stream as the water runs through it. So, and then the hero's journey, because, we brought up the Odyssey and so forth, and that to some extent became the format for the hero's journey, which is sort of the universal story that we see across cultures that, what Campbell talks about and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to say that there is a deeper human measurement that really is the universal measurement, or the measurement of creation, how creation evolves. And, that could be something that we could get back to, or that, I think that has validity, that humanized measurement is a proportion that could carry us forward into the future, possibly.
Well, we sort of stand at a crossroads. Like, these are all put into ideological terms today, and so one reason why I was seeking this sort of human scale, I endeavor to sort of flesh out this human scale concept of perception and identity and balance and whatnot, proportionality, is from reading and studying the discourse of post-humanism, which sort of draws on this strain of French, schizo thinking from the 70s and 80s, which talks about how, our identities can now be decentered from our body, and our identities can exist more outside of ourselves than within ourselves, and we can have we can take on the view of nature, or we can become transhuman and take on the view of machines, and so our bodies, it's like a willful surrender to getting out, to having your identity be constituted from without of yourself, and to give up conscious agency and to become a puppet of the machine, or to be the dog wagged by his tail, or a horse pushed about by his cart, or whatever metaphor you want to use, and that solution is very popular in academia today as the theories of post-humanism. It was a white male's idea that humans should have power, and all they did was create all these awful machines to drown us in. So the way forward is to, I don't think that the idea of humans having consciousness is specifically an evil, like that's taking the very valid argument you make and then pushing it into a level of cynicism, which I find corrupts the nobility of the endeavor of actually having empathy and a global consciousness of the sort that you paint as ideal. It's just the discourse I wandered into when I started seeing what was being taught in university theory classes have had me for the last little while trying to articulate a happy medium. So that's sort of what has driven me to talk about all this stuff. I guess I can leave it there.
Clinton, that was brilliant. And Rob, that was good, because I would say James Joyce invented post-humanism and disguised it as a book.
I think so.
And that goes back to what Rob just mentioned, Hero's Journey, which is where Joseph Campbell Soup got his whole licks from Vico and Finnegan's Wake. Really brilliant how these threads just fly. And then even these French dudes you were talking about, Clinton, and they all got their licks from when Marshall went to Cambridge and got his licks from New Criticism's guys. That thread is amazing. Theodore Sturgeon, sci-fi, probably 50s or early 60s, More Than Human. What was Phil Lesh, Grateful Dead, and Frank Zappa's favorite book? More Than Human by Theodore Sturgeon. Somebody read that book and tell me why it affected him. But anyways, it's important how sci-fi played a role, because it spawned all the hippies who invented the internet, and comic books and sci-fi. That was it. Mad Magazine.
Stuart Brand has a documentary coming out this year called "We Are as Gods."
That's it.
Well, that was where I was going to go. I mean,
yes.
the ultimate aspiration of the human is to become a god.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what the consciousness is gradually expanding, and you have some people with global consciousness. Well, that's the trajectory. I mean, in the science fiction, and then of course we see it played out even with dictators. I mean, most of the dictators eventually elevate themselves to godlike status to maintain control. Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Crazy monkey dream.
What?
Duncan, go ahead.
Crazy monkey dreams.
Yeah.
But if you could conceive it, then I mean, anything that we've conceived, we've worked diligently to manifest.
And
it's still human. It's human scale. I love you guys.
As I already name dropped, Wyndham Lewis's Apes of God, right?
Apes of God, yeah.
Yeah.
But let me just go back for a second. Hold on, Duncan. I'll get right back to you. This is when you said Pinocchio as robot, the film that Kubrick did with Spielberg. Now, I'm not a huge Spielberg fan. He's a great filmmaker, blah, blah, blah. But he said something that I brought up yesterday, and I think it's important when you brought up this idea of balance. He said, when I edited films pre-digital, pre-Avid, whatever, Final Cut Pro, however you edit your films now, digital, there was time to sit back and reflect and think when the film was being rewound on the rewind machines. Now there's no time. So either you go, I'm going to go in the other room while you guys digitally edit fast and give me all the possibilities so I can think, or I'm just going to adapt by hiring 5 digital editors and everything is sped up. So go ahead. Yeah.
May I just jump in? That's analogous to computer programmers who had to wait for their programs to compile before you can run them. And it would take an hour or two to compile your code. The programmer was spent most of his job sitting in the lunchroom. Hey, what are you doing? Oh, I'm waiting for my program to compile.
Yeah.
To see if it works.
Very good. So this thing where Duncan took the word poetic and called it human scale. I love that. Go ahead, Rob.
Well, I'm just going to jump in with kind of a modern example that points to this. So we have the Ukraine war going on, and what has essentially happened is the world decided we're going to cancel Russia, and it's succeeded to some extent with the sanctions and so on and so forth. But I just heard an interesting thread on a YouTube where it seemed that the point they were making was that they thought that the governments and the approach they were taking notes from social media, and everyone, it's now you are a pariah to support Russia, and so it resembles very much cancel culture, right? And everyone in America is all happy and the news reports are all good. Ukraine is doing very well, and our canceling of Russia is working. And it's just an example of sort of the culture of the day applying its understanding of how things would work. And the further point they made was that actually we should be looking for an off-ramp or looking for some sort of peace situation. But there seems to be a reluctance in the West because they're so thrilled with how well their canceling has gone.
Sure.
Yeah. It's all fun and games until the bad thing happens. I wanted to say one thing about Spielberg, the Spielberg example. Gerry there?
Yeah, I'm there. Go ahead, Duncan.
Okay. So if I understood the story, Spielberg was talking about, in the editing process, that there was time to think, blah, blah, blah. To me, that's just proof that Spielberg is a very, very limited artist, and he's a businessman. Has a few arts, because Tucker's got enough money and prestige. He can do whatever he wants in whatever way he wants.
Yeah.
So for him to say that, well, not any time to think because we got him, the answer is so fast. It's just total bullshit.
Well, I imagine a computer programmer sitting around in the lunchroom today going, well, yeah, my code compiled in 6 seconds, but I need an hour to think about it before I go see what the bugs were.
Yeah, well, but see, if you get trapped by other people and how you pursue your passion, you're no longer pursuing your passion. You're just another employee, and that to me is okay. Bring it back around. That to me is the difference between a person who works for an average agency and who's a real artist.
Yeah,
a real artist does what they think they do. They don't get told what to do.
I've heard
Yeah.
it said that Orson Welles was given total free reign to do whatever he wanted with Citizen Kane, and then for the rest of the life, the studios fucked with him, and he was constricted, and nothing he made was quite the way he wanted. And everyone's like, "Oh, Citizen Kane was my favorite movie," and he hated being pinned back to a film he made decades previous, and was never granted that freedom again. Right? So it's like we don't. Or look at the way the internet was invented in 5 years. Sorry, most of our computing technology was invented in 5 years at Xerox PARC because the military and Xerox said, "Hey guys, here's a couple $100 million. Go nuts. We don't care what you do with it." All right, and they had the freedom to create all this stuff. Right.
One point on Orson Welles, it's actually more sinister than that. It was the success and the genius and the pointed and dramatic attack on the wealthy, and particularly on William Randolph Hearst. It was that created the reaction from the studio. Said this guy, who he was a genius, he of course had the War of the Worlds, he was attractive, young, had fantastic at rhetoric, you know. Yeah.
No, that was good, Rob.
They destroyed him. Is my point. It wasn't just that he lost control. They went after him.
Dangerous.
Yeah, he was. There's a lot of evidence on that. You know,
right. And Rob, and Duncan, I agree with you. It's a good point to bring up. But Magnificent Amberson is the film after Citizen Kane, and he was making a distinct point on the bourgeois, and Rockefeller shipped him to Brazil to make a documentary and hijack the message of the Ambersons, and it ruined the film. It hated what they did to his film. It says, "Oh, you can edit it," and Robert Weiss edited so it didn't diss the bourgeois. And I asked all the major Wells people, and they all agreed with me. It's just a theory. But let's go to this other question, Clinton, before we close out pretty soon. Is Roy said, what are Gnostic sciences? So you bring up the word Gnostic science in your article, and I looked up Gnostic in etymology, and it means knowledge, but then it goes into mystical, esoteric, spiritual things, perceiving and discerning. I mean, etymologically, the word goes all over the place. What are Gnostic sciences in regards to your article? Yeah.
Let's go back to McLuhan's understanding through grammar. It's interpreting your sense information and then knowing the truth which underlies what you're sensing, what other people can't see. Gnosticism is a huge topic. It's basically pagan religion, or the ability to put together. Right, it derives from Eastern philosophical traditions. Eric Voegelin would say that it comes from it's an ideology of people who are disenfranchised by their state or enslaved, and thus dream of a better world and know that better world is true, and try to live in a more unified universe. In a religious system, they think that God is evil or malevolent or incompetent, and he made the universe wrong. So they say the world as we see it is wrong. I can see past the world as it is to know what should be, or know what reality is, or I know that I came from a better place and have fallen into this hell, but I can strive to return or create paradise on earth. Now, to go back to McLuhan's sense of it, Gnosticism is people using grammar to interpret nature and to see through the wildness of nature, plants and olives and leaves and animals, and be like, oh, here's what this animal means, and here's the heavenly derived meaning of that in this coherent cosmological system, right? You can have astrology, you can have people alchemy, you can have chemistry, you can have, right? It's just a belief system, a unified belief system that people know is true behind the facade, the appearances of our joke of a secular world, something like this. So
are we Gnostics, Clint?
More, yes. The Matrix film is all about Gnosticism. Yeah, of course. Everyone's a Gnostic nowadays. Everyone's got a vision of how the world really is, or how the world really ought to be, and they try to make that dream image be true and they project that image on top of the world as opposed to getting in touch with the world as it is. McLuhan you can think of him as trying to present an antithesis to the Gnostic thesis. He was in dialectic against the Gnostic thesis, so as to enlighten grammar to a perception of the world as it is, not as fallen, but as being actually accommodating and worthy of the religious, right? He's trying to. He was a hardcore Catholic. He was trying to say, no, God's not wrong. This is not supposed to be going on. These Gnostics who think God is incompetent and who want to make themselves God themselves and steer the ship. We got to look out for those guys. They don't know better than God does. Right? That was his religious opinion as a Catholic.
Mhm.
Go ahead, Duncan.
I saw a thing yesterday which I really liked. I don't know why I didn't save it, but I'll paraphrase as best I can. It basically said to be about the world is to live in a world of constant miracles, and to be judgmental about the world is to live in a cage.
Could you repeat the first part?
To be curious about the world is to live in a world of constant miracles. And to be judgmental about the world is to live in a cage.
Very good. Very good.
So
Who is that?
I don't know. It was just one that floated through.
I'll
And
Google
I
it.
hesitated because I thought, well, some people may think that's corny, and then the more I think about it, I think, that's pretty damn good. So applying it to the current moment, and knowing, they're taking a very judgmental approach to the world. They know how it should be. As opposed to those have a thick, proportional, human scale approach to the world, proceed with humility and wonder. That's as dramatic as I want to get at the moment.
That was good, Duncan. And also, I'm glad you brought up the Matrix, Clinton, because I love that T-shirt. The Matrix was a documentary, and the star of the Matrix came into our bookstore, Midnight Special, in Santa Monica, and bought all the McLuhan books after the movie came out. So
you mean Neo? What's his name? Oh, really?
Yep. He came in and bought all the McLuhan books because we know
no way, dude.
Yeah, the two guys, well, now they're girls. Now, the two men who are now women who made the movie were definitely into McLuhan, when they were writing it. It's
also
deep.
their mother at the time when they were making that was involved in a ayahuasca ceremony group. And I know this. I mean, she was. I don't know. Duncan, you might want to mute there, bud. Sorry.
Yeah.
But anyway, I know this because my mom was in the same group, and it was this plant spirit medicine group was the name of it. And it was using Huicholi spirituality through the use of peyote for, sacred sacrament type thing. And I don't know how much that played into the film, but I just thought I would add that as a caller.
Yeah.
And by the way, is it sexist to say I liked them when they made films as men? Because this last Matrix Resurrection was really awful. It was bad.
Yeah. Look at, dude, everything is sexist and not sexist, and it's fluid and not fluid. Just keep going and don't stop. But I love Duncan telling us that quote because it really evokes Susie's new song about miracles. Go to Susie Williams' YouTube channel and watch her talking about miracles. Miracles is a very important word. McLuhan loved it. One of his favorite jokes is about a miracle. And I'm going to end with that. But I want to tell you a couple quotes that we've touched on, especially the robot talk. This is Wyndham Lewis in 1914. For the sake of your good looks, you must become a machine. Hurry up and get into this harmonious and sane duality. So that's really encompasses a lot of what we're talking about. And then William Carlos Williams said, poetry is but a machine made of words. But McLuhan said, we are all robots we are all robots when uncritically involved in our technologies. So just being, thanking Clinton for writing these articles to stimulate our critical thinking on all these technologies is so important. And it is, communication of the new is a miracle, but not impossible. And that is McLuhan, evoking Sun Ra, who's gone. Here's the cosmic jazz shaman of all time going mainstream. He's in the New York Times and the New Yorker all the time now.
Who?
It's Sun Ra.
Oh, yeah.
The jazz
Yeah, I know him.
And here it is. This is what he said about this impossibility. Sun Ra, the impossible attracts me because everything possible has been done and the world didn't change. So, can we change things by studying the classical trivium, which is rear view mirrorism, reinventing it? I mean, Rob, you did what I'm always striving for is go ahead, Duncan.
Just a point of fact, I do not consider studying the trivium to be rear view mirrorism.
No.
Right. Okay. So yeah, what is very good point. What is Clinton is saying is putting it into the context of today and saying, here's something we can study, and we can reflect on and reinvent. This is the point I was trying to make. Rob did this earlier. In all these aphorisms we throw out by McLuhan or whoever, what I think our job is to reinvent them and reword them. All language is metaphorical, so it's putting something new in between us. Warhol, Andy Warhol's line that they start the movie with is, machines have less problems. I'd like to be a machine, wouldn't you? So he's not saying I want to be a machine. Really, I'd like to be a machine. Wouldn't you? He's posing it more as a question like, wouldn't you like to be a machine? So I think it's about inventing new questions, new metaphors, but more so reinventing the aphorisms. So earlier on, Rob, you said my whole history is wrong instead of saying my whole fallacy is wrong. So, I did it to McLuhan's. Joyce used the pun as a means to, oh God, now I don't even have it in front of me, but it's to something the paradoxical exuberance of being through language. That's a lot. The paradoxical exuberance of being through language. That's what Joyce used the pun as. And I changed it to Joyce uses percepts of doubles as a way of seeing our robot lives through media. So it is this constantly, how can we reinvent McLuhan's? The ignorance of how to use new knowledge stockpiles exponentially. And so I'm more than willing to hear people's closing thoughts or new, we can wrap this up. I have one last question that I want to pose to everybody. and not let anybody answer it. But go ahead, Clinton. What do you want to sum up here, or final thoughts or unresolved questions? You're on mute.
Having just spoken about how Gnosticism is the idea that you've got a perception of the real truth where everyone else can't see it, but you're in touch with the real world, which is sort of like a platonic, right? The ideal world behind the dream that everyone else is in, right? And that sort of had me thinking about how, when it comes to tribalism or when it comes to partisan politics, rather than listen to the other side, it's like, oh, you're not actually believing what they're saying, are you? We psychoanalyze the other side. And we go, oh, when you say that, you're really admitting that you are, you hate this, right? And we would like, right? And usually the only things that people can ultimately end up nowadays accusing their political rivals of indulging in is either being Hitler or being a pedophile, right? But it's like, oh, when you're right, it's like, but you're reading past what the person's saying, and oh, that's just a justification. You're unconscious to your real motivated subconscious drive, which is a desire for this. And thus we can pretend that we know our enemies better than they themselves know, or than they will ever admit. And that way you can diffuse the need to ever actually engage your political tribe, your rival in conversation, because you've got this smug sense of, oh, that this Republican senator voted against this bill that supports gay people. I bet you he gets blown off in airport bathrooms all the time by little boys. Ha 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 ha. Or oh, they're pushing this LGBTQ agenda in the classroom. I bet that left-wing Democrat, exact same thing, right? And so no one is going to ever encounter the other person's rhetorical points. Like, well, the conversation is completely poisoned, right? And this is a form of Gnosticism. This is a form of knowing the real truth behind what you see, so you can ignore the evidence of your senses. You can ignore the language being used. You can ignore the history of a story. You don't need to do any more research because you're in touch with the truth of what's going on, right? That smug sense of living in your own private world. So the idea of taking Gnosticism to that level of, how psychoanalysis as the idea of the human unconscious has led people to become smug, armchair psycho analysts of everyone they dislike, has sort of reached a critical mass in discourse nowadays. So that's an unanswered question for me, because we could probably talk about that for 2 more hours, but
Totally.
Well, we will Lynn, we will on our next mashup, because I would reword in regards to Robbie Dew. I would say, you mean my whole Gnosticism is right? Okay, Robbie, you're up, and then we got Duncan to any sum up questions or unresolved questions.
I don't have anything really super intelligent to say. I strongly agreed with what Clinton was saying. I think there is a bit of that, because the information now comes to your door. I made this point in class yesterday. It used to be, if you wanted bad news, you had to go get a paper, and maybe it was literally on your door, but you had to go and buy something to get bad news. Now it comes to your bed, because that's where most people have their phone in the morning and the night. It's the last thing that they see, and it's the first thing they see. I'm generalizing here, but that's certainly true of young people. Mm-hmm. And so, it's invasive into your most private world. And so now people, because it's so easy and convenient, you can comment on anyone. And so last night, Gerry, we introduced McLuhan, and we did a couple tetrads on TikTok and things like that, and then I threw them for a loop, and they did really well. We did a tetrad on convenience, and they had some really good answers, because and I was pushing them into hidden effects, and they got, okay, what does convenience make obsolete? Patience. I got some very good answers. I didn't write them down as you do, but just thought I'd share.
But your memory was there. That is so cool, Rob. It is so cool. You're a rare breed who actually utilizes the tetrad. Norman Klein put in his book. There's a couple people, it's like Doug Rushkoff going, you got to do bong hits to do tetrads. You know, it's like, no, you don't.
No, I think it varies. Of course, not all the students like it, but sometimes they really enjoy it because it's participatory.
Exactly.
And then, I'll say, if you make me laugh, you get extra credit, and
that is so cool. When you're laughing, you're learning. No, that was
they were starting to get, the smarter ones were starting to get it. The less intellectual are still fumbling with the obvious and the literal, but progress.
Yep. Don't stop and keep going, Frank Zappa. Okay, Duncan, any closing comments or unresolved questions?
Yeah. I think Duncan has made a bold statement, which I hope he will continue to follow through on, because I need an opportunity to read the classical trivium carefully and to have people to discuss it with. If this is the basis, much of McLuhan's thought, and that's very exciting. Clinton this is the second tome that Clinton has led me to. The other one was Sister Miriam Joseph and Shakespeare's use of rhetoric. And the reason, Gerry, that I said I didn't think we were in a mirror was that, to me, it's more like a person with astigmatism picking up a pair of glasses that he or she forgot about and putting them on and seeing the world anew. And that's what the grammar and the rhetoric and dialectic is really about. It's not a rear view mirror.
Yeah,
it's
it's right.
Of important tools.
Seeing the world with new eyes and new glasses. That's beautiful, Duncan. Yeah. Yeah, like okay, so here's the closing. Unless Clinton, did you want to add something else, or you want me to wrap up? Okay, I'm going to wrap up. I want to thank Clinton for writing the dang articles and hosting us. Thank Duncan and Robbie Dew and all the people who participate in all our Laws of Media Reading Club and everything. The question I want to think about rewording and answering in future. Salam McLuhan asks, how about technologies as the collective unconscious and art as the collective unconsciousness? Now, it's a fun question. I've had deep discussions, and sometimes it's what's the difference between conscious and consciousness? What's the difference between art and technology? But let's end in a true McLuhan format joke. A fellow yoga student yesterday taught me this joke, and I think it applies really well, because we talked about God, humans, striving to have some sort of godlike knowledge and peace, and it's extensions of the human being. Something Marshall wrote about. How do we extend our humanness? So the teacher asked the students, what part of the body is closest to God? And, first Sally says, oh, the head. Okay. Anyone else? The next Joey says, oh, the heart. Okay. Anybody else? Sammy goes, no, the feet. And the teacher goes, well, why are the feet closest to God? They're down on the bottom. Well, I went into my sister's bedroom the other day, and her feet were up in the sky, up in the air, and she was going, oh God, I'm coming. And her boyfriend was holding her down.
Wow.
I guess it didn't work. I tried to
How many
make
people are seeing this?
What a close.
Yeah, what a closing. Well, you guys are the meat in my hobo stew. Thank you so much.
All right, guys.